Hello there. Today I would like to talk about the thrifty gene hypothesis. It should be noted that I am not an academic, nor am I even superficially versed in the study of genetics. Therefore, I will be addressing the thrifty gene as it is understood by the layman, not necessarily as it was intended by science. I think this is a valid and important approach as the laymen comprise the majority of our voting public. Their understanding and misunderstanding has tangible consequences in the real world. If one is looking for an academic criticism of the thrifty gene, there are plenty around. I recommend Inventing the Thrifty Gene by Travis Hay. It's accessible, quite interesting, and has absolutely nothing to do with my essay. Some disclaimers before we begin. Because I'm not equipped to deal with the science of it, I'm going to be attacking it from a rhetorical angle as well as from a social justice angle, as well as the broader philosophy at play. So if you're not on board with that, get the heck out now. As a tangent, I am also going to be attacking the idea of IQ tests, as they are a related issue and a product of the same pathologic ideology. You're not on board with IQ tests being insulted? Get the heck out now. Some sections of this are going to be a social justice tirade, so I'm warning you, if you're not on board with that, get the heck out now. It should also be noted that this video is going to be just talk and no pictures, because what the heck kind of pictures am I supposed to put up over this? It should also be noted that I'm going to be talking about some ugly subjects, racism and suicide, so consider that your trigger warning. You're not on board with that, get the heck out now. Finally, comments are disabled because, obviously, I'm going to be talking about racism and bad faith argumentation. What kind of comments do you think I'm going to get on that? Have you ever seen a comment section on a video talking about that sort of thing that didn't immediately devolve into garbage? Once again, if you're not on board with that, get the heck out now. I suppose a final trigger warning is in order. I'm going to be angry, condescending, and snide throughout this, so get out now if you're not on board with that. All that junk out of the way, let's begin. In the early days of the emergence of genetics as a field of study, it was seen as an exciting new frontier, a new angle of inquiry for understanding the world and its ills. In this environment, a notable geneticist called James Neal published the thrifty gene hypothesis. He made the observation that many indigenous people suffered from high rates of obesity and diabetes. He proposed the thrifty gene as a potential mechanism for the obesity epidemic. Neal made the observation that Indians have high rates of obesity, and Indians have mostly Indian genes, therefore the cause could be genetic. He rationalized that Indians had been hunter-gatherers until very recently, and that as hunter-gatherers, they would have operated within an extremely unstable subsistence model, going through regular cycles of feast and famine. He theorized that within this situation it would have been advantageous for Indians to have a genetic trait that allowed them to pack on some serious tonnage during the feast cycles in order to see them through the famine cycles. This trait would then have turned pernicious in the wake of the abundance generated by European-style agriculture, the Europeans and other agricultural races having evolved past their hunter-gatherer genes. This is a simplification and paraphrasation for the sake of brevity and illustration. But while brief and caricatured, I hold that it is broadly accurate. Hopefully you should already see some problems with it. This publication captured the hearts and minds of millions of racists, appearing in news articles and magazines. Apparently the idea that Indians are just genetically defective, not built for the modern world, and less evolved than white people, appealed nicely to people's prejudices. People like having their bigotry affirmed, and this exciting new frontier in race science sold print and secured funds, built careers. Neal, being a diligent and capable scientist, then set out to try and prove his hypothesis. He began by collecting genetic samples. Notably, he visited isolated bush villages in the Amazon, as these, he reasoned, would provide less diluted genes. Among the locals, he developed a reputation as a vampire and a weirdo, polarizing hundreds of people against any notion of science for generations to come. We can imagine some awkward conversations as he badgered people through a translator to provide him with blood, milk, excrement, and other bodily emissions. In the 90s, after decades of work and nearing the end of his life, Neal published a paper retracting the thrifty gene hypothesis, stating that after 40 years of work he had failed to find any evidence that his theory was premature and poorly grounded in the first place. He suggested an alternative hypothesis that bore little resemblance to the original. In other words, he thoroughly debunked his original hypothesis. This retraction failed to generate any significant press. Outside of geneticists invested in academic papers, nobody read it. The newspapers and magazines didn't report on it. Public opinion was not changed. The general public continued to believe in the thrifty Indian gene. Apparently, retraction of those exciting frontiers of race science doesn't make for good press. Then, at about the same time, a Canadian research team made an exciting announcement. They had found the Thrifty gene and confirmed Neil's original hypothesis. Again, the newspapers and magazines latched on, and the imaginations of millions of people were captured. Indians weren't suffering from the effects of colonialism, intergenerational trauma, and various types of oppression. No, they were just genetically broken. Ungrateful, whining primitives trying to blame the world for their own internal deficiencies. But within the genetics community, there was trouble. Some other geneticists noticed glaring problems in the paper and called the research team out on it. One of the authors of the paper then issued a retraction, clarifying that what they had found was not a Thrifty gene and did not confirm Neil's hypothesis. What they had found, in fact, was a gene which was present in a minority of the residents of a few reserves in a specific region of North Ontario, which had a weak association with diabetes. They had published their original paper using hyperbolic language in order to generate press and secure future research funding. This retraction also failed to generate any press for tedious and predictable reasons. And so the Thrifty gene entered the realm of common knowledge, that which is known to be known among the general public, regarded as well-established, incontrovertibly proven fact, in spite of the absence of any evidence to support it. And this is the full story of the Thrifty gene hypothesis. Let's go over some of the problems. In case you don't see why the Canadian paper isn't evidence, let's start there. Neil's hypothesis, at least in the way people employ it, doesn't attempt to answer why a small percentage of the diabetics in a specific region of North Ontario are diabetic. It attempts to answer why Indigenous people as a whole are more prone to obesity. These are not the same thing. In order for the Thrifty gene to be proven, you would have to find a specific gene which is present in the majority of Indigenous people in the majority of Indigenous communities and establish a causal link between that gene and obesity. This is a tall order. The Canadian research team did not do this. What they found was a gene which was only present in a few communities in a small region. Most of the population of these communities did not have the gene, and most of the people with this gene did not have diabetes. This is the equivalent of someone finding a gene in the minority of a population of a small village in Finland which is associated with a 10% higher risk of cirrhosis, and using this to argue that all Eurasians have defective livers. To repeat, the only evidence that anyone has found isn't actually evidence of what they claimed, and when called out on their misrepresentation, the author pled mea culpa. So the hypothesis has no evidence. It's worse than that, because not only does the hypothesis have no evidence, at this point it has negative evidence, because at this point skilled men of science have spent the last 60 years looking and have failed to turn up anything, concrete or otherwise. Absence of evidence is only a credible defense if there's a good reason for the evidence to be absent. We haven't found any wooden armor from the East Coast despite digging up all of the known sites because wood rots fast. There's a simple reason why we would have no physical evidence. We compare. Despite many scientists analyzing myriad people, at this point we have better evidence for the Loch Ness Monster than we do for the Thrifty Indian gene. So the hypothesis has no evidentiary backing. This means that the sole supporting pillar of the theory is its philosophical groundwork. So let's tear into that now, shall we? The philosophical backing of the Thrifty Indian gene is an argument from ignorance. More specifically, it is based on a number of false assumptions and racism. Namely the idea that if you've seen one Indian, you've seen them all. To begin with, there is the presumption that Indigenous people would be a genetic monolith. The people of Eastern Canada are between 16 and 30,000 years removed from the people of Chile, depending on which migration theory you subscribe to. So he's arguing that people separated by 20,000 years in two continents, who had different subsistence models, would have exactly the same selection pressures for this obesity gene. The second false presumption is that all those Indians were hunter-gatherers until very recently. This is too stupid an opinion to be worth addressing. Only someone who is entirely ignorant would argue this, and to have the confidence to argue it without even having done superficial research speaks volumes. The third false assumption is that famine would be common enough among hunter-gatherers to select for traits favoring obesity. This is incorrect. Anthropologists have conducted studies which have found that hunter-gatherers would have a much more stable subsistence model than agriculturalists, on account of the diversity of said subsistence model. Osteoarchaeologists have supported this conclusion. Let's explain this in a little more detail. While the agriculturalist relies heavily on one main crop, the hunter-gatherer draws a little from a great many sources, meaning that for the agriculturalist, if the wheat crop fails, there will be a famine. Whereas for the hunter-gatherer, if the deer crop fails, you can just hunt more turkeys. If the turkeys fail, you can catch more rabbits. And if the rabbits fail, you can catch more fish. And if the fish fail, you can pick more nuts. And if the nuts fail, you can dig more tubers. And if the tubers fail, you can pick more berries. A lot of things have to go wrong all at once for the hunter-gatherer to face famine, while for the agriculturalist, only one thing has to go wrong. This fragility of agriculturalism is exacerbated when we consider the effect of a large urban population on the picture. A subsistence farmer likely has secondary options to get them through a famine. He could butcher the pig or stop selling eggs. He would have to tighten his belt, but he could get by. The urbanites, who produced little to none of their own subsistence and rely almost entirely upon surplus generated by the rural population, would have no such option. If the wheat crop failed, the urbanites would suffer. If there is no agricultural surplus, the urbanites have nothing to subsist on. What this means is that we would be more likely to find a thrifty gene among long-standing urbanized agriculturalists than among dem tribes. To repeat, if frequent famines are likely to select for a thrifty gene, we would be more likely to find a thrifty gene among Frenchmen or Germans than among the Cree. The problems continue. The theory presumes that because those Indians were hunter-gatherers until recently, they wouldn't have had as much time as Europeans to evolve past their thrifty genes. This demonstrates an ignorance of the timeline of farming. People in what is now Mexico developed agriculture 9,000 years ago. For comparison, the British Islands have only been predominantly agriculturalist for 6,000 years, Scandinavia only 4,000. To repeat, people in Mexico have been farming for longer than much of Western Europe. What this means is that based on the standard argumentation, we would be more likely to find a thrifty gene among the Brits or Norwegians than the Maya, yet nobody is out there pushing some crackpot thrifty Gaul or thrifty Viking gene hypothesis. The problems continue. The hypothesis states that obesity in indigenous communities is the product of the thrifty gene in combination with the surplus, stability, and abundance generated by European-style agriculture, that without regular famines, people with the thrifty gene are just destined to get fat. There's an implicit racialism here once more. Even you agricultural Indians just don't know how to farm like real men. You're not putting the land to good use. Us recent immigrants clearly know how to use your land better than you do. So what does that say about you? Let's move past the microaggressions and get to the real problem with this part of the argument. Different First Nations adopted European-style agriculture along a vastly different timeline, and yet all groups started dealing with obesity at about the same time. Let's exemplify what I'm talking about. People of Six Nations adopted European-style agriculture in the first couple decades of the 1800s. The Lakota had European agriculture forced on them in the 1890s. The Maya had it forced on them in about 1600. These adoptions are centuries apart, and yet all of these groups only started getting fat in the 1950s. Why did it take the Maya 350 years when it only took the Iroquois 150? Why did the Sioux take only 50 to 60 years? Stretch this question to every group across 2 continents. If European-style agriculture turned the genes pernicious, why doesn't the adoption of said agriculture seem to affect the timeline? I think I've dealt with every aspect of the philosophy of the thrifty gene. Let's summarize. The thrifty gene hypothesis has no supporting evidence. Its philosophical foundation only makes sense if you are entirely ignorant and a little racist, and it was debunked by its originator. In short, it's a big old nothing sandwich. 2 big fluffy slices of nothing bread, some succulent juicy nothing in between, and some mouth-watering nothing sauce to go on top. And yet this theory continues to be known to be known. Hypocrisy is a very thin meal. It nourisheth not. Let's talk about why all of this is a problem. To begin with, we need to have a word about the nature of information. Information is not neutral. Information has its own agendas, its own intentions. You can say, oh, that's ridiculous, something immaterial can't think and therefore can't have intentions. That's not what I'm arguing. The intention of the inanimate can be derived from its potential. The medium is the message. The intention of water is to run downhill. This communicates the water wheel, which communicates hydroelectric power, which communicates an alternative to coal and its atmospheric pollution. But it also communicates the dam, the disruption of waterways, and the flooding of land for reservoirs. Or to give a more practical example, the intention of your bank details is to withdraw money. If this information were to enter the public sphere, it would have a hostile agenda. No potential good can come of providing your bank details to strangers. There are only negative outcomes. Information is not an objective good in and of itself. Whether information is good derives from its potential utility. To give an example, architecture is inherently positive information. It has the potential to allow someone to build stable structures. The world is better if more people have a basic grasp of architecture. For another example, the nuclear launch codes are inherently hostile information, as there is no potential positive utility for that information. Therefore, it is good that the launch codes are not known to be known. People think of information as something passive, that it is not the information itself nor those who choose to share it that are to blame for any potential negative outcomes. Instead, it is the people who choose to misuse it, those who choose to take this information and act upon it. That it is not cigarettes that kill people, just people that kill people. Our culture, our socio-political environment is not a static, passive thing. It's an active, ever-changing thing. It's a complex phenomenon composed of a great many interlinked, moving parts. When you introduce information into the wider sphere, you are actively engaged in an attempt to change the culture. This takes information out of the realm of the passive and into the active. Sharing information is an action. As is the nature of complex phenomena, changing a single variable can have complex reactions, predictable and otherwise. The presenter is thus directly responsible for the predictable outcomes and indirectly for the unpredictable. One shouts fire in a crowded theater. Is the audience to blame for the ensuing chaos because they couldn't take a joke? The boy who cried wolf might have only intended mischief and humor. The end result was chaos and death. The boy who cried wolf is directly responsible for this. The information is not neutral. This outcome was predictable. His intentions, however benign, his failure to think things through, these are not defenses. The information is not neutral. It offers a predictable threat of explosive change. One encounters a bar fight and places a hatchet on the table. They've changed that dynamic. They may not have directly perpetrated the carnage that follows, but that carnage would not have occurred without their intervention. They are responsible for escalating an already volatile situation. Let's tie this back into the subject. When the Canadian research team chose to term their discovery the Thrifty gene, they attached their discovery to Neal's hypothesis as well as to the popular understanding of it. At this point, the intentions of the researchers are irrelevant, the contents of their research are irrelevant, because people are going to take away things that are not intended. The researchers might only have intended to announce that they found one very specific fat gene. When you call it the Thrifty gene, that tells the general public that you found the fat gene. This was a grossly irresponsible choice of language on the part of the researchers. They did not anticipate how their information would be understood, misunderstood, used, and misused. They probably thought it beneath them to worry about such petty things in service of a higher power. After all, they were men of science. Worrying about the consequences is for the weak and unworthy. Let's give a different example of what I'm describing. In the 1980s, a team conducted a series of IQ tests in indigenous communities. What they found was that 3/4 of Native Americans were mentally retarded, according to the language of the time. I'll deal with IQ tests as a whole in a moment. For now, I just want to talk about the study. What were the intentions of this study? Let's do this by examining the utility of the potential results. The study found that 3/4 of Native people were mentally retarded. What is the utility of this information? Well, for one, it tells people that any academic failure in indigenous communities is not an institutional problem, it's a racial one. That is, there's no point in funding schools for indigenous people because they are genetically designed for failure. It tells institutions of higher education that there's no point in accepting indigenous students, as there's a 3 in 4 chance that they are mentally defective and will ultimately only serve to lower your graduation rate, making you look bad. It tells employers that there's no point even interviewing indigenous job applicants, as there's a 75% chance that they are retards. I know my choice of language is upsetting to some of you. Good. This is how objective science talks about us. What if the study had found otherwise? Let's say instead the study had found that 75% of all Native people were geniuses. What then? A couple of things could happen, but the long and short is that it would also lead to an uptick in racism, the majority population resenting the minority, those who science is objectively declared to be their betters. The study would be known as the Indigenous Übermensch paper. You can imagine where things would go from there. What if instead the study had found no difference in IQ between indigenous and non-indigenous? Then, nothing would have changed. So to summarize, before they had even begun their study, the only potential utility of its findings was to increase and validate racism. This research is inherently hostile. as the best possible outcome of the research would be that the study amounts to nothing besides wasted time and money. This was a grossly immoral study. So, were the people conducting the study just rabid skull measurers? Probably not. They probably didn't think that far ahead. They probably thought their data was neutral, impartial, that it wasn't their responsibility how other people misused it. They were wrong. Scientists have a duty to see that the general public does not misunderstand or abuse their research. When a white supremacist on Twitter talks about innate race differences in IQ, this is science's problem, because they're the ones who handed them that ammunition. Let's give an example of the direct harm that can be done by inconsiderate research. Studies like this gave rise to a concept called the right-brained Indian. This concept proposed, again without evidence, that Native people only had half a functional brain, that only the emotional side was fully functional, and that they thus had very limited capacity for mathematics, literacy, or anything beyond basic animal urges. This in turn led the government of Saskatchewan to propose a right-brained curriculum for Native students. This curriculum would do away with subjects like math, history, science, and anything else that was deemed too difficult for those poor, unevolved Indians with only half a functional brain. Instead, they would be taught things that were more their speed, things like finger painting and how to tell a mop from a broom, things that they believed would prepare them for life as a mentally disabled retard. It was only after mass public outcry from Indigenous people and concerned Canadians that the proposed curriculum was shelved. So, was the government of Saskatchewan at that time a bunch of rabid skull measurers? Again, I don't know, probably not. They were probably just listening to people who they thought knew what they were talking about. You don't need to be consciously racist to do racist things. Racism is to a large extent a problem of the underlying ideology of our society. We could talk about other harms from similar intelligence studies. We could talk about how they provided validation for things like the forced sterilization of Native women, the seizure of Native children to be raised by white families, all because Native women are scientifically proven to be too stupid to raise children. The harms of these and similar research would take hours to enumerate. They are all manifestations of the same problem, how inconsiderate science, knowingly and unknowingly, makes itself the handmaiden of what Simpson termed the splendid blonde beast. Before we return to the Thrifty gene, let's address the subject of IQ tests in general. IQ tests are dumb, unscientific, and morally repugnant. There's a reason why real scientists often deride the social sciences. Real science uses repeatable experiments that try and test for a single variable. IQ tests are not repeatable experiments, and they test for a lot of variables. Let me explain that. If you have someone take 2 IQ tests in a short amount of time, they'll do better with the later tests because they get more familiar with the format of the tests. For this reason, you're not supposed to take IQ tests within 5 to 10 years of one another. IQ tests are not a repeatable experiment because, by necessity, if you repeat this experiment, at least one of the variables changes. IQ tests are also dramatically affected by variables outside the tester's control, for example, sleep deprivation. If how well rested somebody is can affect their performance on the IQ test, then the IQ test isn't just testing for intelligence, it's also testing for sleep deprivation. Let's suppose one of the participants was stressed out, job stress let's say, or maybe the participant is in mourning, they lost a loved one, girlfriend left him. Do you think that would affect the performance on an IQ test? Because if it would, the IQ test isn't just testing for intelligence, it's testing for whether or not the participant has a stable mental state as of taking the test. How about blood sugar? When I've had a lot of sugar recently, I get kind of wired and scattered. Whereas if I've been avoiding carbs for a couple of days, I'm a lot more calm and articulate. If that affects a test, then an IQ test is also testing for blood sugar. What if the participant just doesn't care about the IQ test? One of the primary purposes of an IQ test is as a diagnostic tool to identify why children are struggling in school. So you get a kid who's failing school because he just can't be bothered, he's got a lot going on in his life, and right now he'd rather be fishing. So they put him in an IQ test to see if he's failing school just because he's stupid. Now if he can't be bothered with school tests in general, why do you think he would be bothered with an IQ test? Stupid teacher's making me be here, okay, I'll do your stupid test, okay, done. Now can I go fishing? If how much the participant cares about the test can affect the outcome, then you're not just testing for intelligence, you're also testing for apathy. And when you put all of these things together, plus all the other variables that go into someone's psyche, which I haven't gotten into, when you combine all of those, it becomes impossible to tell which variable you're testing for. There are also problems with the material of the tests themselves. Many IQ tests include math questions. Now, arithmetic is a trainable skill. There is a reason why schools include math classes. Math is a trainable skill. If a skill is trainable, then it's not measuring your innate intelligence. Let's demonstrate this. Many IQ tests have math questions on a timer. You have to solve a math question within a certain amount of time. You get bonus points if you solve it sooner. Do you think somebody who has thoroughly memorized their multiplication tables would do better on that test than somebody who couldn't be bothered? By including math questions, the tests are assuming a level educational playing field, but this conflicts with the overall goal of the tests, which is to diagnose and pathologize those students who are falling behind. It's just drapetomania dressed up in a new suit of fancy clothes. Any slave who runs away from his owner must be mentally defective, because you'd have to be mentally defective to not want to be a slave. Any student who's reluctant to do their homework must be mentally retarded, because only a retard would resent schooling. There are additional problems with the subject matter, because a lot of the tests include general knowledge questions. It should be obvious to any thinking person that the ability to memorize bits of random trivia is in no way related to critical thinking skills. One of the tests I looked into asked the question, what is the primary material that goes into the manufacture of glass? How are you supposed to answer this question correctly if you've never been exposed to this information? General knowledge questions do not test for intelligence, they test for general knowledge. If I ask you, my audience, who Nelson Smalllegs Jr. was, I'm willing to bet that none of you can answer that. Your inability to answer that doesn't have anything to do with your intelligence or lack thereof. All it says about you is that you aren't adequately educated in the field of Indigenous studies. You haven't been exposed to that information. Let's talk about research ethics and cultural bias. Those people subjecting Indigenous children to IQ tests and then using them to make bold proclamations about the intelligence of their race are committing scientific malpractice. Their own code of standards and ethics forbids using tests on groups for which the test was not designed. From the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing, from the American Educational Research Association, American Psychological Association, and National Council on Management in Education. Quotation. In educational, clinical, and counseling applications, test administrators and users should not attempt to evaluate test takers whose special characteristics, age, handicapping considerations, or linguistic, generational, or cultural backgrounds are outside the range of their academic training. End quotation. Quotation. When a test is to be used for a purpose for which it has not been previously validated, or for which there is no supported claim for validity, the user is responsible for providing evidence of validity. End quotation. Quotation. Clinicians should not imply that the interpretations of test data are based on empirical evidence of validity unless such evidence exists for the interpretations given. End quotation. Quotation. Test users should not imply that empirical evidence exists for a relationship among particular test results, prescribed educational plans, and desired student outcomes unless such evidence is available. End quotation. These people should not be using IQ tests on Indigenous people unless the IQ tests were developed for Indigenous people. If they want to use a standard American IQ test on Indigenous children, they have to demonstrate that the test is not going to be biased for this different culture group. Other people doing work on the subject have identified cultural bias within the tests. Let's take the most obvious example, the language barrier. Tests conducted on Navajo children found that children who spoke Navajo as a first language and English as a second language consistently performed significantly lower than children who spoke English as a first language. So either the tests are biased against first language Navajo speakers, or the tests are arguing that learning Navajo is somehow a product of stupidity. This finding tells us something about the ethics of the people putting on the study. It tells me that before doing the study, they did not produce the literature to confirm that the test would be valid for first language Navajo speakers. Let's take another example that really makes me mad. One of these tests asked the question, who was the first person to discover America? This test had several correct answers. They were Columbus, Erickson, the Vikings, Vespucci. One of the potential answers that was specifically listed as a failure was the Indians. And people have the gall to argue with a straight face that IQ tests have no cultural bias. Native kid gets asked a question and he tries to assert the correct answer. We were here first. Objective science just goes, okay, this one's clearly a lost cause. Better slate him for a lobotomy. I got my own pencil. Say the line, kid. Reject your sovereignty. Say that Columbus was here before the Indians. Say it or we'll label you a retard. You want that piece of paper following you around for the rest of your life? Think about what it will do to your job potential. Think it through. Say the line. Before I get properly angry, let's talk about non-Indigenous cultural bias within the same question. To a Canadian, the word America doesn't refer to the Americas, it refers to the United States, the country of the Yanks. Columbus didn't discover America. He never went to America. He discovered Hispaniola and Cuba. Canadians are generally baffled by the way Americans worship Columbus. Why do you have a Columbus Day? He doesn't have anything to do with your country. None of the other acceptable answers have anything to do with America either. Leif Erikson never went to America, he went to Newfoundland. Vespucci, he never went to America, he went to Brazil. If a Canadian is to understand this question using the Canadian dialect, the correct answer to this question would be like Ponce de Leon or Francis Drake. This test would penalize a Canadian for not subscribing to American mythology. In order for an IQ test to be valid among Indigenous people, you would have to develop the test specifically for Indigenous people, just like how an American test isn't going to work for a German because he doesn't speak English. Additionally, a single one-size-fits-all Indigenous test simply isn't going to cut it. There are going to be linguistic, cultural, environmental differences. One of the questions from an IQ test was which direction does the sun set in? The correct answer was west. Indigenous kids in Alberta often gave the answer over the mountains because they've got a connection to their local environment. That's a more practical, meaningful answer for them than simply west. For a Coast Salish kid, that would be a nonsensical answer. They might instead answer over the ocean. We compare. How many urban kids do you think would be able to answer the question, which way is west? Having a meaningful connection to your local environment is going to influence questions like that. You're going to have to develop a separate test for every individual Indigenous group. If that doesn't sound like a reasonable proposition, there's an easy solution. Stop testing us. Let's talk about the potential outcomes of IQ tests. What do you suppose it does to a struggling teenager to learn that objective science thinks you are unfit for any job more sophisticated than a potato peeler? To have mathematical proof of all your suspicions of worthlessness? To have a piece of paper condemning that aspect of your person which makes you human in the first place, telling you that you objectively suck as a human being, that you are barely even human, a borderline animal? To come of age, to develop your adult self with that knowledge hanging over your head? What about the opposite? How would it affect your development to have objective science declare that you are the Übermensch? Smarter and therefore better, more worthy, more deserving, more human even than all those around you? Would that increase the amount of kindness in the world? Or would it lead to resentment? Resentment of all the human refuse surrounding you, those who refuse to acknowledge your superiority and supplicate themselves before you. After all, to reject your superiority would be to reject objective science. What about when your life fails to live up to your delusions of grandeur? When you fail to be the next Napoleon? When the kingdom that objective science has promised you fails to materialize? Would you be equipped to deal with that? What if objective science declares you ordinary? You are not special, and any success you find in your life besides office drone is ultimately going to be down to luck, not talent, as it's been scientifically determined that you have no talent. Would this make it easier for you to follow your dreams? Would it open new avenues to you? Or would it encourage apathy and stagnation? Stephen Hawking once said that only losers care about IQ. Maybe it's sour grapes on my part or a manifestation of my own pathology. But even if the tests were completely accurate, I would still see nothing to recommend them. That was an unfortunately lengthy tangent, but I had to get it out of my head. To my eyes, IQ tests provide the most unambiguous example of research malpractice. With all that out of the way, let's return to the Thrifty gene and discuss its impacts on the people it concerns. The Thrifty Indian gene theory has had an extremely negative impact on the discourse surrounding Indigenous issues, primarily in the discussion of obesity and diabetes. It does this by directing the conversation away from external social phenomena with external social causes and external social solutions, and places it squarely within the realm of the internal and individual. This allows the devout to ignore any potential solution that doesn't directly address the problem of those defective genes. Since its popularization, it has been used to justify cutting funds to social services, which would have had a positive impact on the lives of Indigenous people. It has been used to ignore conversations surrounding post-colonial justice. We take an example. A reserve requests funding to build a rec center, arguing that giving people more options for physical activity will reduce obesity and improve general health and community well-being. This request prompts a public outcry from conservative voters who argue that there's no point in providing services to mitigate obesity as it's a genetic problem. It's just going to happen anyway, so there's no point in wasting the money. Besides that, building a rec center would not just waste money, but it would be an affront to God, who after all designed those Indians with their defective genes in the first place. That might sound like a straw man. If so, it means you're not familiar with the political discourse surrounding Native issues. It's a dumpster fire, a train wreck, a 12-car pile-up of people on roller skates propelling themselves around with their own explosive diarrhea. Returning. The Thrifty gene flattens the conversation. It allows the beast to reject the notion of obesity as a complex social phenomenon and declares it a simple genetic flaw. It allows the beast to reject those potential causes which actually have solutions. It allows the beast to clean its conscience as it willfully ignores those who ask it for help. Why do people get fat? Is it related to poverty, intergenerational trauma, lack of high-quality affordable food, hostile work environment, job stress, unstable social environments, the after-effects of colonialism? No, because these are unscientific, anti-fact, anti-reason, anti-rationality, anti-academic. It's all genetic. Science has proved it. They've been proving it for 60 years. How much more proof do you whining primitives need before you accept your own inferiority? It's genetic. That's a fact. Get over it. Let's talk through one potential cause of obesity that has nothing to do with genes. The territory of Six Nations of the Grand has been undercut by Canadian mining companies on the lookout for rare and valuable minerals like gypsum and quartz. Six Nations is located in rural Ontario. There are a number of livestock farms in the surrounding area, both small-scale grass-fed homesteaders as well as big industrial feedlot operations. These animals produce a lot of manure. This manure is typically stored outside in big heaps. When it rains, bits of manure run downhill into the creeks and into the rivers, and in some cases into abandoned mine shafts, which were inadequately filled in after their closure. Plant farms also contribute to this by spreading manure on the fields to improve fertility. Now, ordinarily this manure water would be filtered by the soil, such that it is clean by the time it reaches the water table. However, the abandoned mine shafts grant the manure water direct access to the aquifer. Thus, many of the wells on Six Nations of the Grand are polluted with E. coli, as well as residual chemicals and heavy metals from the mines which were disturbed in the rain. This means that many people, particularly in rural portions of the community, have poisoned wells and are forced to either build complicated and expensive home filtration systems or buy jugs of chlorinated water in the city. Chlorinated water tastes like poison, particularly if you were raised on well water. It is not pleasant to drink. I know people on the res who do not drink water. When they are thirsty, they grab a Pepsi. The only time they drink a glass of water is if they are in need of a grocery run. They have a rationale for this behavior. Chlorinated water tastes like poison, and I have to pay for it. If I'm going to pay for a beverage, why not take one that tastes good and is caffeinated rather than one that tastes like poison? After all, impartial and unbiased science that was definitely not funded by Big Cola has proven time and again that there's no link between obesity and the consumption of sugary beverages. Diabetes is a proven genetic problem, not a behavioral one, so there's no harm in drinking as much pop as your stomach can bear. This behavior introduces an extreme amount of sugar and caffeine into the body. The caffeine intake alone is 3 or 4 times higher daily than that of a standard coffee drinker. This means that once the practice has continued for a year or two, the person develops a twofold addiction. This makes it additionally difficult for them to switch back to bitter-tasting water once they realize that drinking a gallon of pop a day comes with health problems. The overabundance of sugar changes the taste buds, rendering bitter tastes more extreme. Some people try to kick their pop addiction by switching to coffee, but they often have to put so much sugar into the coffee to make it palatable, and drink so much of it to function under their caffeine addiction that the change becomes irrelevant. This is only one of the many angles that we could approach the issue from without the need to speculate about genetics. Notice how this line of inquiry has evidentiary backing, argumentation that doesn't rely on inaccurate stereotypes, and also makes logical sense. It also doesn't generalize 2 continents worth of people. Note that while it has these significant advantages over the Thrifty gene, it also has the additional advantage of suggesting possible solutions for mitigating the problem. If the water is bad, fund a better water treatment plant and build the infrastructure so that rural homes can access it. Or, better yet, since that seems expensive and rural Ontarians hate having their tax money go to anything besides the military, why not find the sources of water table contamination and plug them up? Fill in the bloody mine shafts properly so that this sort of thing can't happen again and people can go back to drinking their well water. Why not throw your bureaucracy into these issues body and soul and get them done quickly rather than just chipping away at them bit by bit? Credit to the Trudeau government. They've mostly been on the ball when it comes to Indigenous water. The Trudeau government has successfully resolved something like 300 water advisories which built up during Harper's tenure. Fiscal conservatism is a bad thing when it prioritizes a balanced budget over people's lives. I'm no great fan, but credit where credit is due. Trudeau saw a problem and did something, and that in and of itself is not to be taken for bloody granted. Returning to what else could be done, why not spread additional awareness that sugary beverages are not good for you? That those studies the pop companies like to quote were also funded by the pop companies. Why not fund additional studies to prove scientifically that pop causes diabetes? Why not publicize those studies which already exist? These sorts of solutions should be pretty uncontroversial. Unfortunately, our thinking is thoroughly warped by the ideology of the beast and the internal determinant. A significant chunk of the population is unfortunately opposed to doing anything to resolve problems, because doing something, acknowledging a potential solution, places the problem squarely in the realm of the social and not in the realm of the internal determinant. They are opposed to action because doing something to remedy a problem means recognizing that there is a problem in the system of order, and recognizing that there is a problem in the system of order means doing something to solve it. To the splendid blonde beast, potential solutions are not an advantage. Besides giving validation to the beast's apathy, the Thrifty gene also builds apathy within Indigenous people ourselves. Indigenous people are compelled to embrace the Thrifty gene wholeheartedly, or else they risk being labeled backwards, anti-science, provincial, primitive, superstitious, in spite of the fact that the science itself rejects the Thrifty gene. Throughout this essay, I have levied numerous snide comments at objective science. My criticism is mainly at those who abuse that sort of language for a rhetorical purpose while being studiously unaware of problems with the research they are endorsing. The Thrifty gene exists as a big old nothing sandwich. Every attempt to prove it generates evidence against it. Science makes no pretense otherwise. And yet to the general public, when I quite correctly call it out for being a nothing theory with no supporting evidence, suddenly I'm the one who's anti-science in the eyes of the general peer. Because of the stereotype of the stupid, ignorant, superstitious Indian, many native people feel compelled to accept the Thrifty gene unchallenged, lest they live up to the public's negative image and confirm their racist opinions. As always, racism proves itself a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you generate the stereotype of the ignorant, unthinking, anti-science Indian, the Indian feels compelled to go with the flow to embrace that which is known to be known, and in so doing, embraces, unknowingly, the ignorance and anti-science of the general public. And what happens when he does so? In recent years, there's been a movement called body positivity. These people are against feeling ashamed for their failures to live up to the standards set by Sports Illustrated swimsuit models. This is a good thing. Many people do not have the time, motivation, financial resources, youth, health, or build to live up to the expectations of the media. I will use myself as an example. I've never been able to build the sort of chiseled muscle that we are told real men possess. Even back in my toxic masculinity fitness bro phase, my arms just want to build lean, dense muscle which is strong but not showy. I can lift 200 pounds, do 20 chin-ups, draw a war bow, swing a hammer all day. In spite of that, I got skinny arms, which no amount of exercise seems to change. So why should I feel ashamed about that? In spite of the good they're doing for people's well-being, the body positivity movement is also slightly dangerous in that it is easily twisted towards apathy. One trend I see is people shifting it from, it isn't realistic for me to expect to look like a supermodel, so instead I'm just going to focus on being the best me that I can be, into, it isn't realistic for me to look like a supermodel, so I'm not even going to try anything. This is where we come back to the Thrifty gene. I've seen too many people write off their own obesity as genetic. Just like conservatives slashing funding, they argue that there's no helping genetics. It's all predestined. If it's genetic, then it's inevitable. It's stupid to try and fight your genes, just like it's stupid to try and fight against yourself for not being taller or for building ropey muscles. It's to fight against God's plan. So if it's genetic, why bother cleaning up your diet? Why bother getting out and exercising? It's all pointless. They embrace the racist's image of themselves. It's in my nature to be fat and sick. Objective science has proved it. There's no sense in fighting against nature. I've seen people succumb to this trap. I've seen people excuse their eating disorder as a consequence of being native, and in so doing ignore the material causes and the material solutions. Ignore even the possibility of mitigation, of being both healthy and fat. It's defeatism. Let's talk about some other areas that the thrifty gene has infected. Because the thrifty gene is logically incoherent and has no evidentiary backing, but is also known to be known, people feel free to apply it wherever they see fit. As a consequence, in the sphere of public discourse, any issue affecting Aboriginal people and communities can be written off as an inevitable product of the thrifty gene. Let's go through some major examples. Alcoholism is a significant problem in Indigenous communities. What are the causes? Is it a combination of poverty and intergenerational trauma? Well, if you subscribe to the thrifty gene, then clearly it's just the thrifty gene. Indians just don't metabolize alcohol in the same way as normal people on account of their thrifty genes. They metabolize it too quickly and it just goes right to their heads. Or they metabolize it way too slowly and it just stays in their systems way too long. I've heard both of those arguments. Because the thrifty gene is nonsensical, people feel free to invent whatever rules seem intuitive and apply the theory however they like. So what are the solutions? Well, how about language programs? To build community cohesion, to give struggling people a larger goal to work towards, and to provide people with a support group, all the while undoing some of the ills of colonialism and providing people with a sense of purpose. Or, if you subscribe to the thrifty gene, you could just criminalize Indians drinking liquor. Indian tries to buy beer, lock him up since he's being irresponsible, actively trying to turn himself into an addict since those thrifty genes mean they're all genetically designed not to handle alcohol. I'm being hyperbolic here, but I'm not being that hyperbolic. People argue stuff very similar to this. In addition to the obvious problems with this sort of criminalization solution, it fails to take into account the role of alcohol to the alcoholic. Most alcoholics are self-medicating as a way to deal with some other trauma or stressor. If you take away their crutch, they will find another, maybe a worse one. I think alcohol addiction is probably preferable to heroin. What about another issue? Poverty. What causes Indigenous poverty? Is it lack of opportunity, both educational and economic? Is it intergenerational trauma, institutional racism, lack of infrastructure, isolation, poor health services? Well, if you subscribe to the thrifty gene, then clearly it's just the thrifty gene. Indians are just naturally lazy and slow-witted on account of their thrifty genes. Because Indians historically lived in a constant state of famine, they became designed to burn as few calories as possible. This makes them lazy and stupid, designed to do as little moving and as little thinking as possible. So Indians are just poor because they aren't as good workers as white people. This one ain't hyperbolic. I've seen people argue this. Like I said, the public discourse is a dumpster fire. So what's the solutions? Well, what about subsidizing native folks who want to pursue higher education? That relieves at least one of the barriers, and it's something the government is already doing. Easy. Not a quick fix, but it'll make a difference. However, if you subscribe to the thrifty gene, then you might say we shouldn't even be doing that. If they're just poor because they're lazy, then that's their problem, not ours. Nobody wants to work. You don't see me complaining about it. Why don't you try getting a job, you filthy parasite, instead of living off the government and expecting my taxes to pay for your free gas? Once again, this isn't hyperbole. This is an actual argument that people make. Isn't public discourse delightful? The thrifty gene has even infected the mental health sphere. This section is going to get very dark. Trigger warning for discussion of suicide. Indigenous people in Canada suffer from a suicide rate that is 7 times higher than that of Euro-Canadians. The Euro-Canadian rate is already way higher than unacceptable. The Indigenous rate is 7 times higher than unacceptable. It has been labeled a crisis. In some Inuit communities, suicide is the leading cause of death. So what are the causes of this epidemic? Is it poverty? Intergenerational trauma, job stress, the pressures of being occupied by a colonial power which is still trying to take away what little land you have left and regards your continued existence as an inconvenience known as the Indian problem? Is it racism? The fact that your neighbors regard you as genetically inferior, backwards, retarded, lazy, and addict, unfit for the modern world, doomed to die out? That objective science continually provides them with ammunition? Is Indigenous suicide a complex social phenomenon which requires a complex social response? Well, as you might predict, If one subscribes to the Thrifty gene, then no. It's just that darn Thrifty gene acting up again. Those Indians are just killing themselves because they have depression, as a result of low serotonin levels, as a result of those no-good Thrifty genes. In essence, what the beast argues here is that colonialism isn't psychologically and materially harmful to the subject. It's just that those Indians are genetically designed to kill themselves, designed for suicide by nature, by God. They just aren't built for this world. Before I get angry and go off on a tangent, let's address the various points of the actual argument, ignoring any of the social justice arguments, simply dealing with the argument in a scientific manner. 1. The Thrifty gene is baseless nonsense. 2. There's no evidentiary link between the Thrifty gene and serotonin levels. 3. There is no proposed link between the Thrifty gene and serotonin levels. 4. The link between serotonin levels and depression has been disproven. No such link exists. 5. Depression is a contributing factor for suicide, not a causal factor. In every investigated case, there are always other factors at play. Someone is depressed and experiencing cyberbullying, depressed and lost their job, depressed and wife died in a car crash. 6. It's possible that depression itself is not a proper mental illness, but rather a symptom of something else. Further research is required. During the Holocaust, the suicide rate for German Jews jumped up to 12 times the national average. This caused problems for the Nazis, as it meant that they couldn't always rely on their slave labor to be there the next morning. Was it just low serotonin levels that made the Jews off themselves in the labor camps? Did those thrifty Jewish genetics only kick in after 1933? Or do you think it's possible that their social circumstances and the awfulness of the whole situation might conceivably have had something to do with it? Now let's get into the practicalities. Suppose some native youth, suffering from teenage angst, an unsuccessful love life, and the typical problems of identity, causes some problems at school and is sent to a shrink. She tries to explain herself but does a poor job because she is a confused teenager who has had a rough week, and it's hard to talk about your emotions at the best of times. The shrink states that he believes that she is feeling suicidal as a result of depression, as a result of low serotonin levels, as a result of those thrifty Indian genes. He prescribes her some powerful antidepressants. Now she goes back to school, but her fundamental anxieties remain unchanged. Her troubled social life remains unchanged. Her fundamental confusions remain unchanged. The only thing different is that now she feels neither highs nor lows, and is burdened with the knowledge that because the problem is genetic, she will never be safe to get off the drugs and will never feel highs or lows again. With the knowledge that she, her genes, her parents' genes, her family, her race are directly responsible for her unhappiness. Suppose she thinks it through and realizes the unspoken connotation, that the shrink basically told her she is designed to kill herself. How helpful do you think all of that would be? Let's talk about another way it's infected psychiatry: dosages. A long time ago I read a paper from some quack talking about how native patients required lower dosages of medication on account of their thrifty genes. They didn't metabolize the medicine in the same way as normal people. They metabolized it very slowly on account of their thrifty genes, meaning the drug stayed in the body for far too long, so you had to give reduced dosages to prevent an overdose. As cynical as I am about psych meds, here was somebody who, on the basis of a nothing theory with no connection to his discipline, is advocating giving people less medication than his own profession thinks they need. It gets worse. I also remember back then reading something from a different quack which advocated the opposite. He argued that you have to give native people slightly higher dosages because their thrifty genes mean that they metabolize the drugs more slowly than normal people, meaning that they need extra meds to have the same effect. I found it very confusing back when I read these, and I haven't been able to find them since to verify, so you're free to treat these two as hypothetical if you like. But once I learned that the thrifty gene was bunk, stuff like this started to make a lot more sense. All of this together, once again we see how the thrifty gene allows one to flatten the field of discussion, to place indigenous concerns squarely in the realm of the individual and internal, and to avoid or prevent any attempt at coming to grips with them in a more complex form, to understand them even in part as the result of external social phenomena. In this way, the thrifty gene once again demonstrates its fealty to the splendid blonde beast. Rather than addressing indigenous issues in a meaningful material manner, it proposes doing nothing, or else blaming the victim and dismissing their concerns, since they, after all, are the real problem. Or else, when it proposes to do something rather than nothing, often its proposals amount to just dosing those Indians up, whether by psychoactive drugs or just fatalistic ideology, to the point where they are forced to accept their lot and complain no more. In case these issues seem trivial, let's talk about how unethical research kills people. When COVID hit, indigenous communities had some of the highest death rates. This was due to a number of factors, but a significant one was the extremely low vaccination rate. This low vaccination rate was not due to a lack of access. The federal government did a good job of facilitating, and it was generally easier for First Nations people to get shots than the general public. Instead, the low vaccination rate was due to a lack of trust in science. Indigenous people have learned a long time ago that science is willing to hurt them if it furthers science's agenda. Regardless of whether the hurt is intentional or not, malicious or simply callous, it is real and it is felt. When science tells you that you are retarded and genetically defective, one of two things happen. You either accept their judgment and embrace nihilism and defeat, or you reject their validity and focus on proving them wrong. Lacking higher education, rural people are often not equipped to combat academia on its own terms. Even if one was so equipped, lacking access to the forums of academia would limit their potential to be taken seriously and change the conversation. Even those who are engaged in academia are under the pressure of marginalization, and often feel the need to avoid rocking the boat. If an academic Indian were to call out something like the Thrifty gene and attempt publication, their criticism could simply be dismissed as a conflict of interest, racial bias, or worse, they could be derided as anti-science, anti-fact, anti-reason, lumped in with the rest of the backward, uneducated, superstitious hicks. Calling out blatantly racist pseudoscience poses a distinct threat to their careers. Besides this, how do you think it would go over if an Indigenous psychologist criticized the findings of IQ tests of Indigenous children? Anybody who wants to shut him down has a set of ready-made attacks. For instance, this is exactly the type of criticism that the tests have led me to expect from an Indian. Or, it seems unsporting to engage in a battle of wits after having proven that the Indians are unarmed. IQ test people are some of the most unapologetically nasty people in the world. No, I'm not racist. I just want the world to acknowledge the fact that black people are objectively stupider than white people. That's not racism, that's just facts. Matter of fact, you're the racist for trying to push these poor black people into jobs that they're obviously unqualified for. God made them for the plantation. Isn't public discourse lovely? Lacking any effective means of using science and academia to debate science and academia, one either grits his teeth in frustration, as the modern-day equivalents of skull measurers expound on drapetomania, or else one rejects science wholesale. The vaccines come from a faction which has screwed you over in the past, a faction which looks down on you as primitive, retarded, and genetically defective, a faction which has demonstrated time and time again that it cannot be trusted. Is it any wonder people reject the vaccines and in so doing die in droves? All this also makes the jobs of future scientists harder. When Neil grossed people out asking for fluids, he attached the reputation of vampire to his profession as a whole. When a research team lies about curing diabetes and instead blames the victim, the reputation of a liar is attached to that profession as a whole. When the academic starts measuring skulls, the reputation of the racist is attached to that profession as a whole. This in turn makes it difficult for future scientists to secure cooperation and consent. After all, how many people are eager to participate in their own condemnation? This has further detrimental impacts, poisoning the well for indigenous communities who want to conduct their own ethical research. How are we to conduct our own scientific research if you have turned the people against any notion of science? What option do you give us other than to live up to your stereotyping? Racism, unconscious or no, is a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's a saying, a few bad apples. People misunderstand this saying. They think it means something akin to throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It doesn't. It's an abbreviation of a similar saying, a few bad apples spoil the bushel. This saying has a different meaning. When one apple in a basket starts to spoil, the bacteria jumps from one apple to the next, causing a cascade effect which ruins the whole basket. What one has to do to preserve the apples is to frequently check for bad apples and throw them out before the rot can spread. It only takes one bad apple to ruin all the apples. In order to save science and academia, it is essential to thoroughly condemn those elements which are harmful, callous, and unethical. This repudiation must occur at all levels. It must come from the plebeian circles, but also from within academia itself. Science must improve its public outreach so that the academic self-criticism is able to reach the masses. They must actively work to prevent misinformation and pseudoscience from entering the realm of what is known to be known among the general public. Science must purge itself of the undesirable elements, much as one would lance an abscess to prevent gangrene. The thrifty gene is one of the last holdouts of the old scientific racism. It's a zombie theory, a theory that no matter how many attacks are leveled against it, simply refuses to die. Something like this cannot be allowed to happen again.